thanks for joining us this evening from across the world by the look of it. I'm Stuart Wildman, I'm the chair of the RCN History of Nursing Forum, and this event is in partnership with the RCN's Archives and Library Service. I'm really pleased to hand over to Professor Paul Crawford from the University of Nottingham, who's been coordinating the Florence Nightingale Comes Home project. And so I'd like to hand over to Paul for this evening's event.
Well, thanks, Stuart, and welcome to everybody from, well, all around the world. I'm delighted to chair this round table, and you're obviously joining us from various places, but at the moment we're all very focused, I guess, on home and being away from home during this whole COVID experience. For some of us, it's been a positive thing, perhaps a time for reflection. For many people, though, there will be a lot of tragedy in there and certainly disruption in our lives. Florence Nightingale, of course, really knew about disruption. She knew about infection, and she lived through very difficult times. So for all our nurses out there, I hope this round table will offer you something in terms of thinking about your current situation through the lens of history. Our book, Florence Nightingale at Home, is available, and I think the RCN kindly flagged that up with the beautiful cover. So do have a read of that. The book itself and the project deals in the whole business of the material realities of home and the concepts of home and how those apply to the life and work of Florence Nightingale. The project itself was funded by the Arts Humanities Research Council, and I'm delighted to be joined today by my colleagues Anna Greenwood and Richard Bates, and another colleague who isn't joining the round table today, Jonathan Memel. If you want to find out more about that project, go to florencenightingale.org. It's that simple, and there's all sorts of resources to look through there. I'm going to pass on in a moment to Richard, because homes start with our families, they start with our early life. And Florence Nightingale was born in 1820. And Richard, can you tell us a little bit more about how the concept of home shaped her experiences and her approach to health?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Paul, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us from all around the world. I'd just like to echo as well what Paul said about Jonathan Memel's contribution to the book, even though he's not part of the panel tonight, but he's had a lot of input into the ideas that we're going to discuss. The idea of home certainly shaped Nightingale's childhood and her early life. Nightingale's obviously a famous Victorian, and the concept of domesticity was something that the Victorians really held quite dear, and it was a very important concept in the Victorian period. I'm just going to see if I can share some of my screen with you. Let's move that across. So here we've got a sort of typical image of the Victorian domestic ideal. We've got a home with a fireplace and a cat, and a man and presumably his wife who is kind of providing this domestic atmosphere kind of for him, I think we're supposed to assume. And the caption at the bottom says, "Is it really quite necessary, dear, for you to go to this meeting?" Which echoes the conversations that I have with my wife every morning before we start our daily round of Zoom calls. But this is kind of the ideal that is held out to Victorians. We see this sort of intimacy of the couple, and it is just them as well. So this is the kind of the ideal that's in the background of what you're meant to provide, perhaps especially as a woman, to sort of provide this domestic idyll for your husband. Now, this is not necessarily Nightingale's experience of home in her childhood, partly because her family is very wealthy. Their wealth comes from originally from the lead mining industry of Derbyshire. And by the time Nightingale is into her sort of mid-childhood, they have two large homes. This is one in Derbyshire. This is Lea Hurst. It's still there, and this has 15 bedrooms, so pretty large. And then they also bought a second property in Hampshire, which had 80 bedrooms. So there's a very wealthy family. They're not quite at the level of sort of like high aristocracy and dukes and things. They're sort of a level below that, but they are very wealthy. This is a world of privilege, and growing up in such a large house means you don't have the same experience of domesticity, because there's so many people around. There's always people staying, coming for dinner. There are nannies and governesses and butlers and servants, all of whom need managing, and then there's all the people who work on the estate and in agriculture and sort of small industries going on. So there's actually a world of people, and so one of Nightingale's early experiences of home is as an environment that needs managing. Things need to be kept in order, things need to be kept clean, the staff need keeping an eye on, and this is one of the ways in which we can start to see home as formative of Nightingale's experience of institutions. I think later on as well, we start to see her formidable organisational skills first coming out in the context of being given a wing of the family home to manage, and then when she takes over a care home in London in 1853, we can sort of see her cross-applying the same household management skills to that healthcare institution. But Nightingale also thought of home as a bit of a prison. This is their drawing room in Embley. Home was a place where, if you're growing up female in this aristocratic environment, you're not really allowed to express yourself, certainly not allowed to develop professional ambition. You're really supposed to sort of sit around making conversation with the guests, arranging flowers, wearing nice dresses, and generally being part of the decoration yourself. And this is something that Nightingale obviously rebels against, not just in person, but also in writing. As she wrote a kind of feminist sort of semi-rant, if you like, is a sort of critique of Victorian society from a sort of feminist perspective, with some of the quotes you can see there, that she has an awareness that men are on the side of society, that men have constructed this society and sort of imprisoned women within it. So, so she develops this kind of antagonistic relationship to the model of domesticity that's presented to her, and it's something that she wants to escape. As well as something that she benefits from. So I think at that point, maybe I'll just pass on to Anna, who I think can maybe talk a bit more specifically about how Nightingale's emerging ideas about health were also connected to this background and to the idea of the home in general. So I'll pass on to Anna.
Lovely to be invited here today. Thank you very much. Yes, I think when we think about Nightingale's early life, what's quite interesting is that a lot of her formative experience with regard to how she thought about health was also developed in her childhood homes, not only in terms of caring for sick people within the home. Illness wasn't often farmed out to hospitals at that point, especially if you had money. You'd want to keep often the patient within the home. They'd be looked after by a doctor who came into the home, and experiences of sickness were very, very home-centred. But another, and perhaps the most formative way Nightingale's early childhood really influenced her, I think, is through the experience of home visiting. Now, we particularly looked at Nightingale's Derbyshire experiences because that's where she spent the early part of her life before they bought the house in Hampshire. But also it was a place where she went to in the summer. It was like a summer house for them. And what from being a teenager, Nightingale was involved in home visits and home visiting very much in the sort of Victorian philanthropic tradition of people with a bit of status, with a bit of money to show their philanthropy in the community, would visit the houses, the cottages of the working class and would check if they were all right, would perhaps give them advice, perhaps you know, give them some material comforts too sometimes. But that was regarded as part of the genteel philanthropy. It's sometimes called sort of being a lady bountiful, that was very much part of the culture of the time. And definitely Nightingale participated in this. And what I think is so intriguing about Nightingale, and as I've come to study her and understand her more, is she is a person of huge contradictions. You know, at one hand, seen as a feminist and yet not supporting feminism, at one point seen as very progressive and yet also quite establishment and conservative. And another paradox I see is that she's at some level a top-down reformer. She liaises and moves with the great and good in Parliament to try and influence policy, to try and change legislation, to campaign with bigwigs like Edwin Chadwick on sanitary reform. But on another level, she's very grassroots. And it's this experience of the grassroots, of being in home environments of the poor and the working class, that she gleans through her later teenage years, through this visiting, which never leaves her. It never leaves her in terms of the humanity she brings to bigger institutions, to the way she tries to reorientate conversations and back to the normal, whoever normal is, but you know, the average person. And in some ways, this very much plays into Victorian traditions of self-help, ideas. You know, Samuel Smiles in 1859, I think, published the book of the same name, Self-Help, and she's very much part of that self-help tradition. So she's giving advice of how people in their homes can improve their health. And I think the clearest commentary on this is her popular book of 1860, which is called Notes on Nursing, which is essentially a domestic health manual. It's basically advice on where to hang your wet clothes, how to locate your bed, and you know, should it be near the fireplace, how should it be orientated, how air should circulate round a home, how to clean it, how to maintain good hygiene within it. All very, very practical. And now this kind of Nightingale image of hospitals, but also by extension homes, is this light, airy, uncluttered and hygienic space. And that very much comes from her notes on nursing. Another thing I'll just touch on very, very quickly with regard to home is that in the 1890s, which is much, much later in her career, she comes up with the idea of health missioners. And who health missioners are educated women to actually go on a more formal, organised basis to visit working class homes, to advise them on improving health. And again, I think the fact she returned to this right at the very end of her life draws on that teenage experience too of being less formally perhaps that kind of health visitor. And it's something she comes back to even, you know, when she's really, really quite old, she's still thinking about the home being the sort of most important integral private sphere for health. But, and what's quite interesting in both of these, well, in all of these images of taking charge of the home, it's always the woman. I mean, the woman is central to the management of the home and to the way care should be deployed. And really, that's continuing throughout Nightingale's life. And I think, again, that provides an interesting contradiction, really, because in some ways Nightingale is very forward thinking, very progressive. She's giving women agency, she's giving them tips on managing, but at the same time she's reinforcing the gender stereotype of the woman being in the home and the home being the woman's responsibility, which was completely normal for the time. But I think it's these ideas of how women can work in healthcare were also reinforced through her professional experiences when she worked at and managed certain institutions. And I think that really became a model that also fed into later life. I think, Richard, you worked on that particularly. So do you want to talk a little bit to that?
Yeah, thanks. I think it is kind of fascinating. It was fascinating to me how the Victorian period is this age that's really focused on home and domesticity, but it's also an age that builds lots and lots and lots of institutions. And it's interesting to me how those histories kind of intertwine, so that home and domesticity then influence the way that institutions are designed and run, and perhaps healthcare institutions especially. And Nightingale is very interested in the home, but she also is thinking a lot about institutions. And as a woman in this period, she's trying to think about how to bridge the gap between the kind of predominant social ideal that a woman's place is the home, its domestic maternal role, and wanting to influence institutions and wanting to have this kind of professional career outside. So just and the sort of the challenge that she has is sort of encapsulated in this slide. So on the left of the screen now, we've got Nightingale and her sister in a portrait commissioned by their parents when they're teenagers, and on the right we have the kind of classic Victorian image of nurses, the sort of Sarah Gamp cliche. And so Nightingale has to work out how do we get from one position, you know, as kind of upper class women wanting to work in nursing without being seen as being like this. And so the stepping stone really for her is religious institutions. So in the 19th century, you have a lot of religious houses springing up in Britain after Catholicism becomes tolerated. We see lots of new Catholic religious houses, and then subsequently Protestant equivalents, which are kind of places where young unmarried women can go and live and work in the broad field of healthcare and social work and education without necessarily having to sacrifice this social respectability. The main example in Nightingale's personal story is a place called Kaiserswerth in Germany, which is a Protestant deaconesses institution run by a Protestant pastor and his wife. And this is a place where Nightingale goes to spend a few months and to train, and you can sort of see from the image that there's lots going on. It's kind of a full community which includes a school, it includes an orphanage, it includes a hospital where Nightingale works, and a sort of training as a sort of training institution. And so these sisterhoods, they provide a model that Nightingale can then subsequently sort of adapt. And you can see that she does that because she brings a lot of the terminology with her and a lot of the practices with her. Like why, and that language is often domestic language. You know, why did we call senior nurses sisters? Well, it's because it's this analogy from the religious house. So that's the most obvious example, but Nightingale also referred to herself as the mother chief of her nurses, and to the nursing school at St. Thomas's as the mother house. She then created what were called Nightingale homes, so places where trainee nurses would live in this kind of regulated environment. And what these places do is they are enlarging the sphere of things that women can do without losing that social respectability. And by bringing in these kind of religious elements, including, you know, things like nursing uniforms, which are quite closely modelled on sort of sisters' habits, prayer schedules, and you can see that this has a long tail of influence in the way that nursing is set up in Britain not just in the 19th century, but well into the 20th century. And I suspect that if we have some people on the call who did their nursing training back in, say, the 1950s or 60s, that they will probably recognise some elements of this sort of Victorian picture in what they saw when they were young, and this background is really there to bring respectability, and it's Nightingale trying to fight the battle for women to be able to access senior professional roles in the context of Victorian society, and so she has recourse to these models drawn from domestic household management and from religious houses. And so you could argue that these things were, for her, were sort of pragmatic. They were sort of a means to an end. And what she really wanted to do was find ways to get women into senior management positions. So she sets up nursing as a sort of female-only hierarchy, because that's the way that you stop men taking it over. And that's a key difference to what Nightingale does to what these sisterhood institutions do, is that Nightingale puts women in charge. So she doesn't make the male chaplain the head of the institution. She makes the female superintendent of nursing the head of the institution. So that's that is a key difference. But at the same time, Nightingale is taking lots of things that seem to come from the 19th century family ideal, and she sees nursing as a kind of family environment to some extent, and she likes cultivating that aspect. So there is a lot that's drawn there from these sort of religious models. I'm sort of suggesting that part of that is pragmatic, but what I'd like to do is maybe pass back to Paul, because Paul worked quite a lot on Nightingale's broader sense of spirituality, just beyond this kind of example of actual religious houses, because religion, Christianity, faith is something that was quite important to what Nightingale was doing and thinking. So I wonder if, Paul, you could talk a bit about that.
Yes, thanks, Richard. What you said earlier, Richard, about institutions and homely, and if you like, drawing on religious houses and so on. We can kind of think of Nightingale as a sort of, not just a mother-in-chief, but a kind of mother superior, or a lay mother superior. She was a Christian, that was her religion, and spirituality really, I guess, drove her in her seeking out of a life in nursing. So she received a call, as she saw it, from God to nurse, and from then on, and in a more intimate way perhaps than what we hear about in terms of the institutions she built, she was always given to creating households of faith, and that's what she called them. And she was keen on the, if you like, the spirituality and the values within the homes that she lived. And she, this was a passionate approach to spirituality, and a very down-to-earth approach. She didn't really have much time for notions of praying for things. In fact, she writes about what you call a prayer of petition. She writes about asking for something and then seeing if it occurred, and it didn't. So she took quite a scientific approach at that level. In the Victorian period, of course, the whole business of death and dying was framed as going home. And Nightingale also sort of took on board that theme. And she often writes about the death of relatives and the death of people that she cares for in those terms, as people going home. And my goodness, at this point in history, right around the world, we are getting, a big sense of the whole business of transition out of our lives through what's happened with COVID. And I know many of our nurses are traumatized and had a lot of challenges with this particular aspect. One thing that Nightingale was keen about was communicating with families, bereaved families. So when she was in the Crimea and looking after wounded and dying soldiers, she was so diligent in writing letters of condolence to families, to people she didn't know, but she wanted to convey to them that even though those members of the family are far away in the Crimea and, you know, at the end of their lives, that she made sure she bridged the gap. And we hear all the time on the news about how our wonderful nurses are doing their very best in awful circumstances to bridge the gap between the loneliness of being a COVID victim in ICU, well, if people are aware, of course, but in extremis, and that loneliness of not being able to be loved by your family. Nightingale knew about this. 200 years, she knew about this. This wasn't distant from her. She lived it, she was involved in it. So another aspect which is often missed in terms of Nightingale's spirituality was a real active spirituality. She didn't really, shall we say, exclude people of different faiths. In fact, quite the opposite. She was what you call ecumenical. She really did have a passion for different cultures and different religions and different faiths. And her recruitment in nursing underlined that. She wasn't having any of this nonsense of one group versus another, and we can only take this kind of individual into our ranks. And that sensitivity to divergent cultures and experiences for Florence Nightingale was very much part of her experience as being part of the British Empire as it was then. Quite different from nowadays, as we all understand, but I'm going to ask Anna actually to say more about Nightingale in relation to imperial matters, if you will, Anna.
Sure, Paul, no problem. Yeah, it might seem a bit tenuous to start off with to think about a link between imperialism and domesticity, but it's one area of research that I was definitely drawn to, partly because I personally have an interest in the British Empire. And we haven't talked much about Nightingale in the Crimea, but of course when Nightingale, that was what made Nightingale famous, of course, and that's where the image of the Lady of the Lamp came from. It was all the publicity surrounding her as a national heroine, which really sparked Nightingale mania, if you like, and a whole culture about Nightingale, which sees her now as the figurehead of modern nursing. But what's quite interesting is when she comes back from the Crimea in 1856, she's actually really unwell. She's crippled with debilitating tiredness, sort of ennui, sometimes active terrible pain and spinal pain, and this renders her for long periods of time almost immobile. And modern historians, some of them have speculated that maybe she had brucellosis. We can never be sure. These retrospective diagnoses are always quite hard to pin down because they weren't available at the time. But anyway, this post-Crimea phase of Nightingale's life is one where she nails working from home. I mean, what an inspiration to us all now. Basically, she makes a home in London. She's quite reclusive, but that's not that she didn't see people. It's rather that she starts to very strictly manage her diary. She is very selective about who she sees. But she's working all the time, either from her bed or her chaise-longue, and she is subverting, really, ideas of being an invalid. Rather than being an invalid who is unable to work, she uses this space that being an invalid is to turn it into some of the most productive periods of her life. And it's really this phase post-Crimea where Nightingale produces most of her famous work. And why that brings me to empire is because it's not very well known that during this period, she gets really, really passionate about India. Really passionate about the state of sanitary reform in India and really injustice and inequality as she perceives it happening on the Indian subcontinent. Now, her work initially focuses, like it does in the Crimea, on sanitary reform of army barracks, but quite quickly she moves to thinking much more widely about social problems in India. She's involved in oh gosh, all sorts of things: agrarian land tenancy reform, famine relief, women's education, agricultural improvement. And if you look at the India papers, really, of this, you know, what she wrote about India, it's a huge wealth of information. Now, how does this relate to home? Well, it relates to home in many ways. Firstly, she's working from home. So there's that disconnect really from having to giving advice over a place where she's never been. You know, she's never been to India, and yet she's not doing this without knowledge. She gains all the information she can. She has all the reports sent to her. She's tapped into parliamentarians talking about India. Indian reformers themselves come to visit her, and she's trying to do what she can from her situation, literally at home. Also, I think about the way that the language of home is deployed in relation to empire, and that's very, very interesting in itself. I mean, home is used as a critical juxtaposition, if you like. When you look at discourses written by colonial expats during that time, they often juxtapose the climate, the geography, the culture that they find themselves in their new colonial location against the familiar that they're missing, home, you know, home sweet home. And it's also has a more problematic political meaning because it's embedded with some ideas of maybe civilizing superiority, ideas that home is what's missing because they're in this uncivilized place now. Now, Nightingale didn't so much really engage with that, but another imperial use of home as a very powerful metaphor was how it was used in political discourse as a means of describing British dominance. So in political rhetoric of the time, Indians and Africans, for example, but others in Commonwealth too, were often referred to as fellow subjects, part of the home of the British Empire. A lovely quote from Nightingale in 1858 is, England, what did she say? England is home wherever her people dwell. And again, that's that inclusive idea, which brings the citizens of empire under British sort of guardianship, really. Now, even though parts of that may feel distasteful and patriarchal to a modern eye, actually Nightingale's never that in her language. She's really incredibly culturally sensitive in a lot of the ways she advises health advice to be disseminated in the Indian context. She also, however, thinks of ways that British models that have worked well in the British context might be exported successfully to other contexts. So, for example, the health missioners that I mentioned earlier is a scheme that she also tries to roll out. The idea of having sort of educated women enter people's homes to educate them on health reform is something that she thinks should also be done in India, albeit with Indian women being the people that convey that information, so it's culturally relevant, etc., within the home. So when I was thinking about Nightingale Home India, it was really thinking about the way she physically conducted her work on India, literally from her bed, the way she mobilized the idea of home as a metaphor for inclusiveness, and also the way she transferred ideas that she developed and put forward for the British context to go into to be placed in the colonial one. But I don't want to get too sort of carried away with this bigger context. And I'm aware that one of the things that people always like to hear about, and is really one of the big difficult things to come to terms with and really get a grasp on as a historian of Florence Nightingale, because she was so contradictory and difficult to pigeonhole in some ways, was what was she like as a person? Perhaps Paul, could you talk to that?
Yeah, absolutely. My goodness, Florence Nightingale. She was feisty. She was no nonsense. She was persistent. She was determined. And she's probably the greatest model that we could have at the moment for working from home, because after the Crimean War, when she did most of her work, actually after 1854, she did much of her work from her couch or her bed, and produced so many guidelines really for so many different aspects of what was to become in the 20th century the NHS and the thing we know as public health. So she really did, she was passionate and dedicated to what she was doing. Of course, she had many advantages. Of course, we know that, but boy, did she use them. She was also often against a lot of representations of Florence Nightingale. She was also a very generous and very kind person. And she often sent gifts, little gifts, to nurses who were ill, to various people who were poorly. And in that sense, we don't often hear about that in some of the biographies and some of the writing about Nightingale. What was different with the project that we involved ourselves in is we made use of the fullest searchable collection of Nightingale's writing in the world. And we looked very closely at the kinds of things she said and what other people said about her. And that detailing is really important when it comes to judging how she was as a person, what she really did. And quite frankly, you should take with a very big cup of sauce, never mind a pinch of sauce, some of the early non-historical studies of Nightingale, which take up rather politicized and political positions rather than deal with the archives in detail. What I would say, I'd like to ask Richard to say a little in a moment, is I would say if we saw Nightingale today, we would first see it in the briefing room at number 10 on the COVID crisis. She would probably, perhaps with a stick, just gently push aside to keep social distancing, push aside Boris Johnson. And she would sort out all the statistics for a start. She would have insisted on PPE very early on and made sure that people were out and about with masks on, I'm sure. And she would have extended into the whole business of sanitation. Actually, before she did that, she would have updated herself from 19th century understandings, of course. But I'd like to pass on to Richard to say something about what is often a difficult oppositional sense, that Nightingale versus Seacole, like a football match. And perhaps you could say something about that, Richard.
Okay, well, I can try. I mean, this always comes up, and this is because there's quite a lot of stuff around in the media that has been for the last sort of 20 years, as Paul says, kind of putting them into opposition. So I'll just try and just talk for probably like 2 minutes, because we'll get onto the Q&A, but just what do we actually know? So the main source to read on this is actually Seacole's memoir called The Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Many Lands, which was revived in the 1980s by some Black British historians, Ziggy Alexander and Audrey Dugee, who republished it and kind of promoted Seacole a little bit as someone whose legacy had been forgotten. So Seacole was a mixed race Jamaican woman whose family ran kind of hotel type institutions in Jamaica. She travelled, she was in the Panama Canal in the 1850s and ended up sort of running a kind of hotel there. And in 1854, she kind of got swept up in the war fever of the Crimean War. And she came to Britain to actually look after her investments, to do some business transactions in the autumn of 1854, just as the reporting of the war is ongoing. And sort of swept up in that enthusiasm, she applies to join Nightingale's nursing mission. Nightingale's already gone by this point. So she goes to Seacole goes to London and tries to meet with Nightingale's sort of representatives who were vetting the nurses to send out in future parties, and is refused. Seacole writes that she experiences this as a kind of racially charged rejection. She thinks it's because she's black, which may well be true. The counterpoint to that, though, is that the number one question that those recruiters would have asked Seacole is, what hospital experience of nursing do you have? And Seacole was not a hospital nurse, right? And they were determined to only send out people with serious experience of nursing in hospitals. So Seacole wouldn't have been sent out anyway with her professional background, if you like, even if the racial issue hadn't been there. Seacole then decides to go to the Crimea by herself and set up a business there called the British Hotel, where it seems to have been more like a sort of restaurant / general store, which she runs in the Crimea. So she's a long way away from Nightingale, who's in Scutari, who's in Turkey, 300 miles away. She passes through very briefly. She spends a night at Nightingale's hospital in Turkey and reports Nightingale as being civil and friendly towards her. There's no opposition there. And then, so there's no contact between them. The only thing that then comes up later is that there's a letter that that Nightingale writes to her brother-in-law at the time of the Franco-Prussian War, and Nightingale writes about Seacole in sort of derogatory terms. So she sort of accuses Seacole of having run a quasi brothel in the Crimea. So I think she probably disapproved of the fact that she sold alcohol there, and that there may have been some sort of bawdy entertainments and things. So that's basically all we have. The only other piece of information that we have is that when there was a kind of appeal to raise funds on behalf of Seacole, that Nightingale contributed to it. So she kind of disliked her that much. So that's just a sort of brief overview of it, because it is so charred, and because Seacole has been brought up as this kind of icon of Black British nursing, and why was she forgotten? And so there's been a tendency to kind of blame the whole historical neglect of Seacole on Nightingale, which is kind of unfair, I think.
Thanks, Richard, so much for that. I think, you know, if Nightingale was around now, she'd certainly have shares in Costa or in Starbucks, because she really did look at replacing alcohol with coffee. And in fact, if you look at a lot of Nightingale's efforts, she really understood the need for home comforts. So in some ways, Mary Seacole and Florence Nightingale, in some of the themes of their lives and their work, although they're very different, both of them had a lot of energy and concern for home comforts, for the basic home comforts that we all need. So it would be great if we all go forward, perhaps looking at what they shared rather than what came between them. And perhaps just start with the payment issue, and big congratulations to Royal College of Nursing for their push on nursing pay. This keeps coming around, disappointingly, but you know, Nightingale, as I understand, and Richard or Anna may correct me, she viewed that women of independent means, you know, should be able to take care of themselves, but those without independent means should be paid.
Correct, and she did push for improved working conditions and for better pay for nurses. And she also looked into things, I've seen evidence of her looking into things like pension schemes and friendly societies for the nurses who came through the St. Thomas's training school. So she was, again, this is sort of the Derbyshire connection, but she was looking into the sort of mutual aid societies that were set up by women workers in textile mills around Derbyshire, and looking at them as a model for setting up a kind of private pension scheme for her nurses in the 1870s. I think the original question also talked about like applause and public recognition. I think Nightingale was a bit less keen on that, because she was more of the sort of vision of nursing as a kind of vocation that's sort of self-sacrificing, and you don't complain about your lot and seek that kind of public prestige quite so much. But certainly the nurses of working class background, she wanted them well paid, well looked after into their own age, and she definitely took steps to fight for that. Anna, do you want to talk more about the kind of reputation and?
Yeah, no, it's fine. In terms of her posthumous reputation, why did the sort of lady with the lamp come to dominate more than the statistician or the manager? And I think that there's a lot of things going on there. I think firstly, we have to acknowledge this explosion of Nightingale mania, really, in the late 1850s. I mean, there's a whole industry explodes around her. I mean, they're manufacturing figurines, busts, plates, woodblock prints, cameos, letterheads. I mean, she is a heroine. And I think what she does for nursing is she also plays into the Victorian image of the angel in the house. And she's so different to the Sarah Gamp figure, which was famously portrayed of nursing in Martin Chuzzlewit in the 1840s, the Dickens novel published in the 1840s, where the nurse was dissolute, sloppy, drunk, negligent, bad-mannered, that I think people just clung to that completely different idea as nursing can be reinvented on the back of this figure. And I think people, that her inner circle were well aware she was an extremely intelligent and gifted statistician. I think she was a very clever, she was a very good writer. We can see that. She was very proficient in gaining people's confidence and a great lobbyist as well. Very, you know, absolutely amazing, as well as a very practical manager. But those things don't sell papers as much. And the imagery of that isn't perhaps as exciting as this idea of the compassionate, feminine lady with the lamp. And in a sense, that's been very enduring, hasn't it? I mean, nursing today is still seen as aligned to those, even though nurses have to be managers and jugglers, and it's still aligned to that image of femininity, care, compassion, which you need as well. But that has perhaps been part of the problem the NHS has faced in recruiting men to nursing, who also can have those attributes too, but they've never, it's not, those traits haven't been, what's the word, historically associated with men. So I think there's a lot of, the way nursing is configured today relies a lot on these stereotypes that grew up posthumously.
So I'll just say a little bit generally, because I'd have to go through and have a look in more detail of specific relationships with specific bodies. I mean, the difficulty with Nightingale is when you start reading books about Nightingale, you never finish the task. There is so much written on her and so much reference to different relationships and the details of those. What I would say more broadly is that you know, Nightingale, like a lot of people in the 19th century, did consider converting to Catholicism, and she was a big pal of Henry Manning, who was made Cardinal Manning. So she had a lot of Catholic friends, a lot of Catholic correspondence. She visited a lot of Catholic institutions. And as I said, she considered some of the values of Catholicism in relation to the example there in terms of human care and the woman's role in that. So some of the models for nursing came from that way. I
can briefly add a bit if you want on the specifics of that. So there was a couple of different Catholic groups, Irish nuns, that went out to the Crimean War. One that went out with Nightingale herself, which was the London-based Bermondsey Convent. And then what the question is referring to is a second group that went out from Ireland with the second group of nurses that went out to the Crimea, led by Mary Stanley, who was also a Catholic convert and one of Nightingale's friends. And there was tension there definitely between them and Nightingale, because they were taking their sort of Catholic-based model of care and just implementing it under the auspices of the British Army in these hospitals. And so there was political tension back in England about, is there too much Catholic influence? Are we at risk of converting too many of our soldiers to Catholicism? So there was tension both in terms of who's controlling these Catholic nuns / nurses, and are we at risk of allowing Catholics too great an input into this whole mission, and could that risk the mission by causing political controversy back in London? So it got political. You can read the Nightingale biographies, and there's also a book on nursing in the Crimean War by Carol Helmstadter, which is called Nursing Beyond Nightingale. So she's looking at some of these other groups that weren't controlled by Nightingale.
And she was, Richard, I think you're right, she was also in a period of, quite a lot of turbulence in relation to Anglicanism and Catholicism and their particular status and presence in society. So it's not surprising really that the Nightingale story will be caught up in some of the brambles of history, rather like the Trump-Biden situation now. There's the brambles of history, the brambles of different political mindsets and so on. And so we do need to be careful, don't we, Richard and Anna, to pick up on the archives, the writings, and to dig down in that. And I hope people today have enjoyed at least some introduction to how we've dug down somewhat on the issue of home and the concepts of home in our book, Florence Nightingale at Home.